Thank you all for coming this evening, and thank you for welcoming me in your beautiful city. One of the advantages of where I'm staying was to be able to come to the city this morning by ferry, which was a lovely way to arrive in town and see the bay, the bridge, and where you all live. That pleasure has a slightly intimidating personal side to it, in that this is the first time ever in about 10 years of talking to forums such as this that I've had some members of my own family in the audience. So I'll take that as it comes. But thank you all for coming. First of all, I'd like to give a broad look at Hamas, where it fits into the Middle East crisis, how it has evolved. I expect that one of the wondrous things about Hamas and the Middle East crisis generally is that people all have their pet aspect of the crisis on which they want an explanation, they want an understanding, they want some light shed, or they want to shed some light of their own, and that comes through in questions. So what I'll do first is to set out where I see it after virtually 2 years of intense immersion in Hamas and also in the crisis generally. You'd have to say that it's truly remarkable that for more than 6 decades, the Palestinian crisis has been such an enduring element of US foreign policy, one that imposes itself on president after president, defeating administration after administration. For a good deal of that time, Yasser Arafat was the best known, though not necessarily the best understood leader of the Palestinian people. For much of that time, he was treated as an enemy, at others a sometimes ally. Always indefatigable, Arafat was observed by the West with both frustration and admiration as he slipped and slid between the layers of his own personal and political complexity. He was the one-man band who single-handedly created and then took as his own the powerful Fatah movement and the PLO. For all his failings, all his foibles, it was Arafat who kept alive the flame of Palestinian nationalism. But for the last 20 years, a parallel Palestinian force was emerging. Known to us today as Hamas, this organization's first few years were devoted to secret underground planning. It was not till the harrowing early days of the First Intifada in 1987 that this determined new movement burst upon the Palestinian scene, launching itself on a trajectory by which it finally and undeniably overhauled and overwhelmed the fractured remnants of Arafat's Fatah movement to become the most distinct, most organized, and the most efficient nationalist voice in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. For all that, Hamas was shaped and is led today by a man who, outside the circles of the Middle East cognoscenti, is hardly known in Western capitals. Khalid Mishal was a child in a village called Silwad in the Jerusalem mountains on the West Bank in the late 1950s, when Arafat was girding himself for war against Israel. With the exception of a brief holiday return to the West Bank as a student in 1975, Mashal has not been back to the occupied territories since the days after the Six-Day War in 1967. His family fled, driven by fear of a repeat of the Israeli excesses of 1948. They joined tens of thousands who took flight, compounding a pre-existing Palestinian refugee crisis that already had become a linchpin in regional and Cold War politics and policy. Mashal's family resettled in Kuwait, where by age 11, he was an avowed nationalist. By age 15, he declared himself to be an Islamist, adopting the strict spiritual regimen of the Muslim Brotherhood, the 1920s Egyptian Islamist movement, which inspires much Islamic resistance and terrorism, even today. At that time, according to one of his brothers, Mashal became something of a religious enforcer in the family home, checking daily on who had said their prayers and giving them a whack when they hadn't. As a physics student at Kuwait University in the 1970s, Mashal went head-to-head with the secular, Fatah-controlled Palestinian Student Union, challenging its mortgage on control of all things Palestinian. In the 1980s, Mashal's work as a physics teacher in Kuwait provided him with excellent cover for his covert activities on behalf of the movement that was to become Hamas. It was an underground cell led by Mashal that devised the plan for an Islamist-oriented jihad in the occupied territories, a move that amounted to a declaration of war on Yasser Arafat as much as on Israel. During these underground years, Mashal revealed a flair for fundraising on a grand scale. At the same time, he proved to be a sound disciple of a warrior preacher called Sheikh Abdul Azam, who will be better known to some of you for his mentoring of Osama bin Laden. Azam's regular travels between Pakistan and Afghanistan and the Middle East always included transit stops in Kuwait City, much of which were spent at the home of Khalid Mishal, teaching his host the dark art of jihad, the management of resistance, and the sense of being a government and a leader in exile. The amalgam that emerged from all of this is an international movement, which today is controlled by Khalid Mishal from the southern suburbs of Damascus, the Syrian capital, where he operates from a dusty bunker festooned with security cameras. Hamas became a nationalist and a religious movement that would eclipse Arafat, his Fatah movement, and the PLO. Hamas was better organized, more frightening in its tactics, more resolute. Hamas would not renounce violence. It would not recognize the State of Israel. By its worldview, there was eminent logic in its stand. The Palestinian people were acutely aware that in making both these gestures to an American-sponsored peace process, Yasser Arafat had achieved nothing for his movement or for the Palestinian people. Hamas contributed to that stalemate for the Palestinians with its waves of brutal suicide bombings. But so too did successive Israeli governments, which played Fatah and Hamas against each other, demanding that as Israel's partner in peace, Arafat must guarantee Israel's security by putting a stop to the Hamas bombs. But at the same time, Israel refused to deal with Arafat, either because of the excesses of the Hamas violence or because of Arafat's own backsliding when he felt threatened by the rise of Hamas. Frequent error in Western attempts to understand Hamas was a failure to grasp the organizational breadth of what was a global movement, with its roots deep in the Palestinian diaspora and other Islamic communities around the world. Because Hamas was seen to have emerged from the cauldron of the Intifada in Gaza and to be under the local leadership of the revered Gaza holy man, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, it was not until after the horrors of the September 11 attacks on New York and Washington that authorities in the US and in Europe made serious attempts to corral the terrorists in their own backyards. Just how Hamas survived for as long as it did in the US is one of the more surprising elements of the worldwide story of these radical Islamists. I want you to picture Washington, D.C. In your minds, put yourselves on the Mall at the foot of the Washington Monument. A few hundred yards away on Pennsylvania Avenue is J. Edgar Hoover Building, home to the FBI. Just a few doors up is the U.S. Department of Justice. Maybe 12 miles to the northeast, the CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia. All points covered, you would have thought. But just a few miles south from the CIA is Leafy Falls Church, over the state line in Virginia, but still a part of Greater Washington. That's where a man called Musa Abu Marzouk lived in the late 1980s and the early 1990s on South 6th Street. Apart from him observing him mowing his lawns occasionally, the neighbors knew nothing, the authorities even less. Abu Marzouk was a renter, no driver's license, no property tax. His business card named a firm, but stated no line of business. His company was not registered locally. In the phone book, it was unlisted. Yet in America, this was Mr. Hamas, living in the shadow of the Washington Monument.